Let me ask you this: what what's wrong with American journalism?
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is, huh?
How many days do you have? Yeah, I guess probably the film is particularly critical of. Well, let me put it this way. I think this film basically establishes or follows on with the thesis in that wonderful book written by Noam Chomsky and Professor Edward Herman, jointly authored, even though people kind of forget about Herman because Chomsky is such a superstar. But the book is called Manufacturing Consent. That is, as Glenn Greenwald says in our film, that manufacturing consent is kind of like the Rosetta Stone for understanding the mainstream media and what's wrong with it. So the thesis of manufacturing consent, if I can sum it up, which is difficult to get it down to one sentence,
Yeah, go ahead with that.
it's basically, I would say the thesis is that the mainstream corporate media in the United States function as a tacit propaganda arm for powerful government and corporate elites. And it doesn't mean that the journalists working within those institutions like the New York Times consider themselves working for a propaganda arm, but that's just kind of the way it works out. And it is a self-selecting process where the journalists working in the mainstream media, to get ahead, they know there are certain stories and certain attitudes and behaviors and orthodoxies that they need to accept of what's acceptable in journalism and what isn't. And
let me stop you right there for 1 second. Give me I've been a journalist for close to 20 years. I've known a number of journalists. There isn't a single one of them who doesn't think that they pursue truth. Not who I've met.
I agree. They all think they're doing their jobs. They all think they're just doing their jobs. But if you talk to some of them, and for example, I've talked to a reporter for the New York Times who saw my film, and I saw him afterwards, and I said, I hope you don't hate me because we took some hard shots at the New York Times. And he said, no, are you kidding? We complain about this stuff all the time among ourselves. In other words, the journalists themselves know there's a problem. For one thing, most reporters, have a healthy skepticism about their bosses. And so there's nothing new about that if you've been a reporter, as I have, and it sounds like you have too. And I have worked in the mainstream media. And yeah, everybody's trying to do their jobs. But when people like this guy from the New York Times see all governments lie, it's not like they don't agree that there's something wrong, and for example, with the New York Times, everybody virtually agrees that they, as Carl Bernstein says in our film, when it came to the journalism being done in the run-up to war in Iraq, the New York Times was among the most egregious because they were running stories that were planted in their paper, by basically Cheney and the White House that were not true and which they didn't bother really to check out. They were so thrilled that they had this inside scoop, that Saddam Hussein was getting various things that would help him to build a nuclear weapon, according to sources in the White House, that they went with that, and they weren't critical, skeptical, or doing their job as journalists.
It is sometimes difficult when you get yourself something, handed to you on the sly, and it's particularly salacious, to not think to yourself, oh, I have got A1 for the next week.
Yeah, I know. Well, that is the problem with so-called access journalism, which I guess a lot of beat reporters working in the mainstream media depend on. Whether you're covering the White House or whether you're covering City Hall, you may consider that the last thing you can do is upset the officials in the White House or in City Hall, because then you'll lose your access. Amy Goodman calls that the access of evil.
That's clever. That's
which is clever. A pretty good line. Yeah. And I mean, it is true. You can't have it both ways. I mean, what do you see as your job as a journalist? Playing golf with the mayor and then getting some tidbit that he decides to throw you, or this is if you're a local reporter, or is it your job to investigate where the mayor's getting his money from, and whether that's influencing his decision making, or is that happening with other members of council? All of that kind of stuff is way more important than than the so-called access that is so highly valued.